In the empirical world, however, only money is free from any quality and exclusively determined by quantity. Since we are unable to grasp pure being as pure energy in order to trace the particularity of the phenomena from the quantitative modifications of being or energy, and since we always have some kind of relationship, even though not always exactly the same one, with all specific things, their elements and origins, money is completely cut off from the corresponding relationships that concern it. Pure economic value has been embodied in a substance whose quantitative conditions bring about all kinds of peculiar formations without being able to bring into being anything other than its quantity. Thus, one of the major tendencies of life, the reduction of quality to quantity, achieves its highest and uniquely perfect representation in money. Here too, money is the pinnacle of a cultural historical series of developments which unambiguously determines its direction. Chapter 4: Individual Freedom. Freedom exists in conjunction with duties. The development of each human fate can be represented as an uninterrupted alternation between bondage and release, obligation and freedom. This initial appraisal, however, presents us with a distinction whose abruptness is tempered by closer investigation. For what we regard as freedom is often in fact only a change of obligations, as a new obligation replaces one that we have borne hitherto, we sense above all that the old burden has been removed. Because we are free from it, we seem at first to be completely free until the new duty, which initially we bear, as it were, with hitherto untaxed and therefore particularly strong sets of muscles, makes its weight felt as these muscles, too, gradually tire. The process of liberation now starts again with this new duty, just as it had ended at this very point. This pattern is not repeated in a quantitatively uniform manner in all forms of bondage. Rather, there are some with which the note of freedom is associated longer, more intensively and more consciously than with others. Some accomplishments that are no less rigidly required of some than of others and that are generally no less demanding on the powers of the personality nonetheless seem to allow the personality a particularly large amount of freedom. The difference in obligations which leads to this difference in the freedom compatible with obligations is of the following type. Each obligation that does not exist with regard to a mere idea corresponds to the right of someone else to make demands. For this reason, moral philosophy always identifies ethical freedom with those obligations imposed by an ideal or social imperative or by one's own ego. The other person's demands can consist of the personal actions and deeds of the person under obligation, or they can be realized at least in the immediate outcome of personal labor. Or, finally, it need only be a certain object, the use of which someone can rightly lay claim to, although he has no influence whatsoever concerning the manner in which the person under obligation procures this object for him. This scale is also that of the degrees of freedom that exist with the performance of a duty. The graduations of this freedom depend on whether the duties are directly personal or apply only to the products of labor. Naturally, every obligation is generally resolved through the personal actions of the human subject. But it makes a great deal of difference as to whether the rights of the person entitled to some service extend directly to the person under obligation himself or simply to the product of the latter's labor or, finally, to the product in itself regardless of whether the person under obligation acquired the product through his own labor or not. Even if the advantages of the entitled person remained objectively the same, the first of these forms of obligation would completely bind the obligated person, the second would permit him a little more latitude and the third considerable latitude. The most extreme example of the first type is slavery. In this case, the obligation does not involve a service that is in some way objectively defined, but instead refers to the person himself who performs the service. It includes the employment of all the available energy of the human subject. If, under modern conditions, duties that involve the whole capacity to work as such but not the objectively defined result of this capacity, as with certain categories of workers, civil servants and domestic servants, do not offend against freedom in too crass a manner, then this is a result either of the temporal restriction in the periods of service or of the possibility of selecting the people whom one wishes to be obligated to, or a result of the magnitude of what is offered in return, which makes the obligated person feel, at the same time, that he too has rights. The bondsmen are about at this level, as long as they belong completely, and with their entire working capacity, to their lord's domain, or rather, as long as their services are unmeasured. The transition to the second level occurs when the services are temporally limited, but this does not imply that this level was always later historically. On the contrary, the Deterioration in peasants' freedom very often leads from the second to the first level of obligation. This second level is definitely reached when, instead of a fixed amount of labor time and energy, a specific product of labor is required. At this level, one can observe a certain gradation, namely, that the manorial serf had to hand over either an aliquot part of the yield from the soil, for example, every 10th sheaf of corn, or a permanently fixed amount of corn, cattle, honey, etc. Although the latter arrangement might possibly be the more severe and more difficult, it nonetheless creates great individual freedom for the obligated person, for it makes the lord of the manor more indifferent towards the peasant's type of husbandry. If the serf only produces what is sufficient for his payment to the lord of the manor, then the latter has no interest in the total yield. But this is most important in the case of the aliquot payment, where supervision, coercive measures and oppression are the consequences. The fixing of payments with regard to an absolute rather than to a relative quantity is in itself a transitional phenomenon which suggests that it will be replaced by money. In principle, at this level as a whole, the complete freedom and release of the personality as such from the relationship of obligation could, in fact, be realized, for the person entitled to some service is concerned only with receiving a given objective payment, regardless of where the obligated person procures it. But in view of the economic organization it can actually only be procured by the latter through his own labor, and it is upon this basis that the relationship is constructed.